everything coast to coast with your hosts, Buddy Sotello and Evan Ginzburg. Evan Ginzburg, please introduce our guest this week.
There you go. Buddy is in California, yours truly in New York, which is why we call it Coast to Coast. And we are bringing on board Ryan K. Boman from the distinguished Gorilla Position, one of the one or two handfuls of wrestling websites that I enjoy and respect, as opposed to the bombardment of Raw and SmackDown reviews and over-analysis. We have at the Gorilla Position writers, historians, and content that will survive the ages. The owner, editor, publisher, Ryan K. Boman. How are you, Ryan?
I'm doing great, and it's a pleasure to be on with you guys. You know, I'm a big fan of the show, big fan of yours, Evan, and it's nice to make your acquaintance, sir.
Oh, well, I really appreciate that, too. And you don't have to call me sir. It's usually most people, when they know they're talking to a lawyer or do anything but say anything pleasant, they usually shirk away or try to get headed towards the hills. But I had a chance to read your website, and very well. First of all, you said that you've been involved in wrestling since you were 14 years old.
15.
15.
And when I say that, being involved, I mean like the kid that picked up the programs off the floor, folded up the chairs, you know, kind of anything to be around the guys. Everybody was so larger than life to me as a kid, but I did have the opportunity at a young age to get to know some people in the wrestling business. So it was of course, back in those days, they wouldn't tell us everything. You know, they kept a lot of things secret, and you were kind of, you know, I can remember growing up, you know, if you're not in the ring, don't touch the ring. That was what we were always told. You know, so it was a little bit different era then. And then over time, when I became a writer, I became a sports writer for several publications. And then eventually I just kind of morphed that into pro wrestling.
Now, what fed was that you first got involved in?
It would be South Broadway in St. Louis. It's the promoter there is still there. He's been, oh my gosh, he's probably been in the business 45 years now. I know him and his family, great people. And just kind of one of those things where you're the kid that hangs around at the end of the show because you just want to see how it all works. And luckily I got the chance to be around people. You know, I got to see guys come through town in St. Louis, like Harley Race and Ric Flair. And, you know, the first time I met Ric Flair, I was about 10 years old, and I thought I was going to pee my pants. You know, it was so big to me at the time. So just watching that and staying in touch with people that I knew over the years is kind of what kept me on that passion trail, so to speak, of pro wrestling.
Who took you to the show originally?
Oh, my father, always. Yeah, my dad still, as a matter of fact, shout out to my dad. It's his birthday today. So
congratulations.
But that was the person who, yeah, he pretty much, even though he really wasn't as into it as I was and probably didn't understand it the same way, he knew that I loved it. So, you know, he made that happen for me.
And who were your favorite wrestlers at the time, other than Harley Race and Ric Flair?
Obviously, a lot of the guys in St. Louis, because they were on our local show, Wrestling at the Chase. But I'd say mostly growing up, Ricky Steamboat, who I actually had the chance to work with a couple years ago, and he's an amazing person. He's just tremendous. The Von Erichs, Magnum TA, a lot of the baby faces. I always saw myself as a hero, you know, so I kind of wanted to live vicariously through them.
That's fantastic. That's really wonderful. So that's how that started your life. And then, so what made you decide to be a writer as opposed to being involved in other areas of wrestling?
Well, I actually originally did try out to be a wrestler, and that's why I respect the wrestlers so much, because about a week into that, I realized I can't do this. I mean, I'm a pretty big guy, you know, I'm 6'3", you know, and all that stuff. But after realizing the bumps and the bruises and the pain that they go through, I started pursuing other things, like maybe I'll do the ring announcing, or maybe I'll help, you know, put the show together, or maybe I'll run the popcorn stand. But all I know is I don't want to hit those ropes every week and get hurt. The first time I ever ran the ring and hit ropes, I couldn't get out of bed the next day. It hurt that bad. And I thought, well, then maybe this just isn't for me.
But you still wanted to be involved in it in some capacities. And why do you feel like you had that love for wrestling? What is it that kept you, because you couldn't be involved in it in the ring? What made you still want to be involved in the area of professional wrestling?
Well, I think it again, it's almost like being the kid that runs away and joins the circus. It's like you never have to grow up in the pro wrestling business. If you do it the right way, I should say, you never have to grow up. And, I pursued other interests. I knew that I was going to be a writer. I had already made up my mind at a young age that I was going to be a professional writer. I was either going to write books or movies or write for a newspaper. And I felt like, well, this is something I could be able to contribute to the industry without actually having to go out and be a performer. And I'm one of those people that I've always said I would rather be in the back and the guy nobody's heard of. I have no desire to be on television. I have no desire to be, an active performer, but to be somebody that can be a contributor and just know you make a small part of it, that meant a lot to me. So I've carried that with me for a long time now.
Orion, you keep using the word writer, and you are a writer. Like Mike Mooneyham is a, newspaper journalist. You're a legitimate writer. In wrestling, it seems to me that their concept generally, as far as writing, is a bombardment of information and scoops and over-analysis of basically meaningless TV shows. What was your vision with Gorilla Position? Because your website is certainly very different from most of the websites that are out there.
Well, I didn't want to do the National Enquirer type, website. I didn't like, first of all, I had friends that were in the business. I wouldn't want to be reporting rumors about them or anything like that. I looked at it, and I will credit my partner, Michael Melkor, who actually works for Ohio Valley Wrestling, as coming up with the tagline, telling the stories of pro wrestling storytellers. And that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to be storytellers. We didn't want to be, obviously, we want people to have opinion columns. I love to go back and show off some of the old school stuff. I always like to do the historical pieces, and I like to do the human. I'm more of a human interest and a feature writer than anything else. So I'm not a big scoop guy, so to speak. You will never see us report on what someone put on their Twitter page, or something like that. I don't want to follow it closely enough. I want to kind of still make it sort of a fairy tale.
There you go. And what constitutes being a quality wrestling writer as opposed to a so-called wrestling journalist?
A hack.
I think it's finding that human connection with the people that are involved in the business. I've had the opportunity to talk to pro wrestlers where they've opened up to me about, contemplating suicide, about, I wrote an article about a wrestler who came out of the closet. I think it's more of being able to find that person inside the character that, that you can open that book up and let the rest of the world see. And I think there's a lot of quality people in wrestling. I think they've got some great stories, and that's what I've always wanted to tell. Those stories, their personal journeys, are what's more important to me than anything they do in front of a camera.
So do you think the bar is set low as far as much of wrestling quote unquote journalism? Because what I see a lot of is it's almost like rap feuds. This wrestler insulted that wrestler, and they're going back and forth, and they're reporting this like it's a major story, and I'm like, I don't really care about any of this.
Well, I don't know. My politically correct answer would just be that I don't have any interest in those types of things. I mean, there are certain things. Obviously, if someone would come out on social media and make some kind of wild remark, like a racist remark or something, that's obviously news. But I would rather write an opinion column about it than just kind of, again, re-chirp it back out there. And a lot of times, and this is no disrespect to anybody else, because everybody has a place. Everybody has their place in terms of covering pro wrestling. So I would not disparage anybody else, but at the same time, I would just say I write about the things that interest me. And a lot of the hoo-ha, the gossip and the BS that's out there doesn't interest me.
There you go. Buddy, we're having some sound issues.
Yeah, I was wondering if anyone else had experienced that too. Ryan, I think you're having some sort of connection issues. I hate
I don't
to.
know. Can you guys hear me?
A little bit better there, but
just
yeah,
move
you were
forward.
cutting off, unfortunately. Yes, and what you were saying was so important. I hated to have it, it be cut off because what you were saying was something that really, I think does set you apart from your what other journalists are doing and what makes Gorilla Position a different kind of website than just people who are looking around to just get what happened on Raw, what happened on SmackDown. I mean, the quality of your articles definitely go much deeper than your standard, SmackDown analysis. And so I think what you said there was really important. In fact, if you did, I hate to say this, but if you don't mind repeating it just real quickly, because we got that interference, I want you to have a chance to.
Okay. No, I just feel like
Much
the
better.
human interest side of the industry and the personalities that are behind those characters, they are more important and really more intriguing stories than just who won and lost in the ring. At some point, you have to evolve. You have to do something different. And when we set out to start the website 3 years ago, that's what I wanted. I wanted it to be, I don't know, a cross between People Magazine and Sports Illustrated. Where we could tell somebody's stories, their background. Again, people that have talked to me about their depression, talked to me about how they were abused when they were a kid. One of the things, and I'm not bragging here, but I think one of the gifts I've been able to do when it comes to being an interviewer is getting people to open up. And I don't think that a lot of wrestling journalists look that deep into somebody's soul. And that's kind of what I wanted to do. That's where the tagline, telling the stories of pro wrestling storytellers, because their stories behind the camera are much more important than what happens in the ring.
Thank you for repeating that, because that was a very important point. In fact, Evan and I have said that very thing about the WWE. Why doesn't the WWE use the empty arena time that they have, instead of giving promos to 5 or 6 people live that are staying around? Why don't they do more of these sort of human interest stories and delve in deeper? And I think the conclusion that Evan and I came up with, which is that Vince really just doesn't care about these people as people, because who knows, next week he's going to fire them, or have them jump through a burning building, for his pleasure, because he saw it on TV, last week. So it's good that you're out there trying to cover those stories. In fact, you feature some of Evan's stuff every once in a while too, which he had a great write-up on Mr. Wrestling too, who passed this week. And did you ever have a chance to watch him wrestle in St. Louis?
I never saw him live in St. Louis. I remember watching him in Georgia when the show was on WTBS, because my grandparents had cable, so when I got to be over there on Saturdays, I got to see wrestling too. Nice. And he's another great example of that old throwback, old school. The guy sold the mask gimmick. They said he showered in his mask, for God's sakes. I mean, that's that kayfabe era that's sort of missing today. And we'll never be able to go back to that because of the internet and all the shoot interviews that people do and everything like that now. But, to be able to have those memories of a time when you were so passionate about it, because deep down as a little kid, you thought it was real.
Yeah, and so that's a good question to ask back to you, which is there some way to recapture that sort of fun that people can have with wrestling, or they used to have with wrestling, when there was kayfabe, yet now that there is no way of restoring kayfabe the way that it was before? Is there a way to recapture that? Is there a Fed, or are there wrestlers that you feel that do capture that right now?
I think there's definitely some great wrestlers out there that can for a minute make you suspend your disbelief in the middle of a match and think, oh my gosh, I just got lost in this. But unfortunately, it's sort of, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And now we have a wrestling audience that's so splintered. They all have so many different opinions because of social media, and they're allowed to share those opinions. And it's almost like it's like letting the genie out of the bottle. Now the fans know so much that you almost can't go back to the way it was. Everybody, they say you can't please all the people all the time. Well, in wrestling, you can't please any of the people all the time, because everybody is going to be dissatisfied because they know too much.
And so, does that doom the future of wrestling? What is it? What does that make you feel about like where wrestling is headed? Because eventually, you know, all of us kayfabers, you know, people who remember kayfabe, are going to die out, and then what's going to be the future then? You know, you have such a different audience that you have now. Will they really be that loyal to stuff as time, you know, moves forward?
In a word, no, I don't think so. I think there's so many more entertainment options now, and Evan and I have talked about the state of wrestling currently, where it's hard to watch these empty arena matches. It's just so hard to sit through and be entertained when there's not that visceral reaction from a crowd. And it scares me for the future of wrestling, because even if we make it through this era and this COVID-19 crisis and people go back, we've already lost a huge chunk of the audience that have decided to tune out. And you never know if those people are going to come back. I see the wrestling audience becoming much more of a niche audience going forward. And I think, and it always has been, but I think it'll be on a much smaller scale. I think the industry will get smaller, but in some ways that also might make it better.
I agree. I have not watched wrestling in 3 months, and I plan on watching New Japan. I believe it's July 11th when the crowd comes back. I'll watch New Japan World, and there'll be a live crowd in the audience, and it'll feel like wrestling as opposed to they threw together a TV show. You know,
I'm sorry. To that point, I just watched clips of it was an old WCW Nitro during the NWO era, and there is nothing like the reaction. You know, the sound of that crowd, that pop. You know, with 22,000 people and everybody's rabid and hot, and it's not the same as today. The crowds today are way more tame and they're less passionate, and it seems like they get less passionate every year as it goes forward, as they become more desensitized to everything.
I had an interesting experience. I had some comps for SmackDown in Madison Square Garden, and I'm sitting there. It's like a sea of little kids with their parents. So every time the wrestler would come out, they'd play the music, and the kids would pop like it's Pavlov's dogs. And the wrestling itself was instantly forgettable. And I'm sitting there thinking about Bruno and Billy Graham and Morocco, Piper. I'm thinking about all these giants, and I was like numb. About two hours into it, I just picked myself up and left. I mean, I was numb. You know, it was meaningless, utterly meaningless.
Well, in some ways, back then too, when you're talking the Bruno Sammartino days and so forth, wrestling was hard to find. It was a rarity. When you did find it, it was a special thing, especially here in the Bay Area. We didn't have wrestling, you know, didn't come as often as like at Madison Square Garden, where you could always count on matches every month. Here, we would sometimes skip several months. It would be 4 or 5 months between matches. And the indie stuff wasn't as strong especially in the 80s and 90s. So this territory was kind of dead for a long time. There wasn't a lot of stuff going on around here. And so when you found it, it was a really special thing. And now with having, you know, shows on literally pretty much every single day of the week, plus you have YouTube as a way to tune into wrestling whenever you feel like it, you know, essentially. I was watching Harley Race against Gentleman George Wells for absolutely no apparent reason.
Yes.
I don't know. I just was. And so that availability of wrestling that takes away from that, special moment, like, oh, I caught it when it was on, or like when you would go to your grandparents to watch, Mid-South or later NWA wrestling. Because, yeah, I too would do that over to friends' places. I would go over to friends' houses that had cable packages where they would get the NWA or whatever, and we'd make sure to be there a Saturday afternoon so we could catch that. Now, you don't have to make many effort to watch wrestling. It's all around you. Maybe that lack of specialness, is taken away from. You take that and you take away kayfabe. It's not the it doesn't have that special element to it that sort of made, I think, people such big fans, because you're part of sort of this wrestling fan family that not everyone else shared. Does that make some sense?
That makes absolute sense. It felt like there was a mystery and a specialness to the business at one time, especially. And I think everything when you're young seems larger than life because you're a little kid. But now, as technology's changed, the funny thing, one of the lost parts of the wrestling business is the reason I started writing about wrestling is because I became friends with Bill Apter, and I wrote a story about Bill in the Miami Herald. And then from there, he said, maybe you should pursue wrestling. Maybe you should start writing about wrestling. You're such a fan. People in the business, blah, 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 blah. And that's sort of where my journey started back in 2017. But one of the things that I think is most lost right now is the wrestling magazines. They were so important to wrestling back in the day and to the fans because, as you said, we didn't get to see the shows on a regular basis. So the wrestling magazine sort of filled that void. So a lot of the fandom has really changed, and of course the world changes, so everything changes. But I think that's something that's really missing in wrestling too, is the fact that you didn't get to see it all the time, and if you wanted to know about it, you had to buy the magazines. You had to make sure you were there at 6:05 on Saturday afternoon to see WTBS. In many ways, I think that's the oversaturation of it has cost a lot to the business in general and to the enjoyment of it more than anything.
In fact, that's a perfect transition of where a question I really wanted to ask you, is that you are one of the people that have made that transition from print journalism, wrestling print journalism, to the internet with Gorilla Position. Can you tell me about the differences in how you report things from a a written perspective to now an internet perspective? What has changed and what things maybe stay the same for you?
Well, the biggest difference now is I'm the boss, so I get to do whatever I want. But no, honestly, it's more of as someone who grew up typing on a typewriter to now being where I'm in front of a keyboard and I have a laptop, I can do stuff on my phone. It was more for me was just grasping the technology. I was an old school guy. I was a newspaper guy. I started in the newspaper business when I was 15 years old. And, to have done it that way for so long. And then again, everything changed with technology coming along. And, I had to learn how to work WordPress. I had to learn how to work all these different programs. And now it's kind of something I can do in my sleep. But at the beginning, that was my biggest challenge was, and I don't consider myself to be technologically, illiterate, but at the same time, it's just so different of a process of, I would type out a column, print it out and hand it to my editor. Now I, sit at home, type something out and I can put it live within minutes. That basically you can have an instant deadline.
How has that changed though, the way you approach a story versus print, when you did something in print, knowing that it wasn't going to maybe come out as quickly as now when you do something through the internet and that it's going to be instantaneous?
Well, I think you change your perspective on writing because you're looking to give the audience like instant gratification due to social media. You want to get it out. You have to share things. Where in the newspaper print era, I would turn it into my boss and I would wait a few days and I would see what he had to say. I think that you target a different demographic when it comes to the technology now, as opposed to, the newspaper audience quite frankly, especially whenever I got ready to leave a few years ago, was a lot older audience as opposed to the internet audience, which is very much a younger crowd, a little more technologically hip, so to speak. And so some of the stories, you kind of want to hit them with something. You want to come with something that's a little more direct, as opposed to the newspaper business, which to me was a lot more laid back.
That's a very interesting point, because it's, but how about like, and I'm just saying your approach, like, are you looking for different types of stories now because you're internet based as opposed to the stories that you would normally cover for when you were doing it in newspaper format or magazine?
I think I've always been a feature writer. That's a columnist and a feature writer. So I've just always looked for things that that interest me and that I think will interest other people. So in some ways it hasn't changed, but in terms of the technical side of it, it's changed a lot.
Ryan, do you think the typical wrestling fan truly understands the business? I understand kayfabe is dead, but sometimes I just cringe when I read things online. For example, quote, all the wrestlers burned through fortunes on wine, women, and song. And I just think they have some very strange misconceptions about the business in general. And many times they'll rise in defense of Vince McMahon and WWE, even after ruthlessly, laying off dozens of workers in the middle of a pandemic. And I don't think they really grasp, that not a lot of wrestlers end up well when all is said and done.
I think the problem a lot of times is a lot of the wrestling fans watch these shoot interviews, and I have friends who have done shoot interviews in the business, and they've literally told me I couldn't remember what happened, so I just made something up. So
Wow.
when the fans hear that stuff and then they carry it and they regurgitate it, I can just say to anybody, and again, I am not currently working for a pro wrestling company. My best friend and business partner works for two right now currently, but I can honestly say that until you've been there and backstage and you've seen exactly how the gears are grinding, I don't think I don't think you can read my columns or I mean, I'm certainly not going to tell everything I know because it would get me in trouble with some people. But at the same time, when you've been backstage and you've watched guys, come back from the back and they've almost broken their neck or anything like that, it's just a different perspective than if you just read about it online or you watch interviews or you listen to podcasts or you go to the shows and buy a ticket. And that's great. I love the fact that fans are that passionate about it and they want to know that. But there are so many things that go on behind the scenes, particularly in WWE, and you and I have talked about that, which we probably can't talk about here either. But that
you can talk about anything you want. That's the beautiful thing about this show is if you want to talk about it, you can.
I can tell you, I've been in positions with some wrestlers on the road before, places where I've seen guys do some really crazy stuff and probably engaged in some of that myself with them. But having said that, I that's one thing that I think that a lot of the people don't really understand, that all these people are real people behind the scenes. They're real. They have real lives. They have families. They have kids. They have homes to pay for. And I think when we get into this whole hypercritical of this guy or this person sucks, blah, 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 they're just trying to feed their family. They're just trying to work and make a living and hopefully make a name for themselves in the wrestling business. So that's the one side that I think that if you've been around professional wrestlers and people that have been involved in the business, that you get more of that perspective. You get that human side of it.
I have had wrestler friends say to me, Evan, I am always in pain. Always. Okay, after 20, 30 years, 40 years of bumps, okay, I am always in pain. And for the fanboys to do they're independent contractors and they know what they're getting into. I don't think when you're 20 years old and your dream is in front of you with a contract sitting on a table, I don't think you really know what you're getting into. That you are at some point going to have your body break down. And, to defend a billion-dollar corporation instead of the worker, I think every wrestler should have a pension, 401k, health benefits. They're sacrificing their body, quote unquote, for the business. But with the WWE, it's a family business. You follow my logic?
Yeah, I agree. I think the time for a wrestling union was 20 years ago when the business was at its peak in the late 90s. Had one of the rosters or both the rosters said, we refuse, I don't care what the ratings are. I don't care what the money is. We refuse to perform at XYZ pay-per-view unless you pay us, unless you give us a union. It would be very easy for them to get in touch with somebody like SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, and have them provide the guidance for wrestlers to have a union. I agree wholeheartedly with that. And that's another thing I don't think the fans realize is the amount of pain most of these people, especially the older guys, are in today because they wrestle 250, 300, or should I say 350 days a year. Wink. They put their bodies through hell, and they're entitled to some type of retirement.
You mentioned Harley Race. At the end, he was in a wheelchair. It broke my heart to see the great Harley Race in a wheelchair. I saw him come into Madison Square Garden, wrestle Backlund, title versus title. Saw him wrestle Dusty Rhodes at the Garden for the NWA title. Harley Race was magnificent in his prime, and to see somebody older and, in a wheelchair. Abdullah the Butcher, the last time I saw him was in a wheelchair. A lot of these guys. And, I'm not going to name names, but you shouldn't have to hawk a T-shirt or do a GoFundMe, when you've sacrificed for 40 years, some of these guys, if not longer. I mean, there are guys wrestling today in their 70s. Do you realize that? Guys like Greg Valentine, Jimmy Valiant, they're in their 70s in wrestling. So, the fans, this is why websites like the Gorilla Position are important, because I had an argument with a wrestling journalist. I won't name names, but I said, honestly, when I never see you guys critical of WWE, I wonder if it's because, you have press credentials and backstage access, etc., so on, or whatnot. And because, I've always been an outspoken critic of, them not taking care of their guys, and now women as well.
The funny thing about mentioning Harley is when I was living out in Jefferson City, Missouri, he lived in a little town called Eldon, and I got to know him for a while. And he had a company out there called WLW, and he was having trouble getting around then. He would literally sweat trying to walk. That was in '99. So you imagine the last 20 years of his life, he was pretty much constantly in pain.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's a reason there's a mile-long trail of, guys who died young because, the pain pill addictions, and it's hard to wake up. One wrestler said he would wake up in the morning and crawl to his pain pills. Okay, and I said, this guy's not going to live to a ripe old age, and he didn't.
And it's sort of it tails into what you also covered in The Wrestler, which is that you have a dual addiction. It isn't just the pain pills, which I myself had a huge problem with when I broke my hip in 2016. Not wrestling, just taking the garbage out. I fell down my stairs and broke my hip. And
You're accident prone. He broke his shoulder this year.
Yeah, no, it was funny. I spent a lifetime in the ring and never had a major injury, and I've broken my shoulder and broken my hip just doing simple, stupid stuff. But anyway, the other side of it is that you also are taking away the fame that these people had. And that's the other drug that people are addicted to on top of the pain pills themselves. And I think that the psychological problems that being addicted to those pills combined with the loss of fame and the loss of attention and that loss of camaraderie and that loss of routine that people have. For instance, a really sad example is Crash Holly, who was over at APW. He got his early training over at APW, and he came and he visited us in between the parts of when the WWE was just transitioning him out. You know, he just won the Hardcore Championship, and we were all excited because he was, you know, bringing fame to APW. He came, he visited us, really nice guy. But you could see, like, after the Hardcore Championship, and he lost that, and then coming back to us and visiting us, that kind of level of, like, where he was down from where he was up was a huge, like, rubber band snap. And he never recovered from that. And that drove him towards more pills, towards giving into the addiction side of things, and it killed him.
I have a friend who wrestled for both WCW and WWE, and he will call me once in a while and say, "What do you think about this idea about me getting back in the business?" And I want to say to him all the time, "Brother, you've been gone for 15 years, you know what, and has gone on to have a happy life." And I just keep telling him, you know, stop worrying about it. It's that part of your life is over and move on. But as you said, the fame and the adulation and that pop they get when they come out, that's just as addictive as the drugs are.
You know, I know guys who headlined Madison Square Garden who ended up pushing a broom. And it was humiliating for them. It was humiliating. But the job had pension and benefits and 401k. So, you know, that was the trade-off. But imagine going from being a star on the level of headlining the mecca of sports to pushing a broom, okay? And look, my whole family's blue collar. My dad said, you know, somebody has to clean the toilets. There's no shame in honest work, but that's a big drop from celebrity to you know, the grind.
And some guys can laugh about it and just say, "Hey, it was fun while it lasted." But for others, it's a huge ego snap, and I think the wrestler perfectly embodied that. In fact, that's the thing that I tell people is I don't think there's ever been a film that's embodied how someone goes from being famous to being non-famous and what the impact of that is to someone than Mickey Rourke did in The Wrestler.
When we did The Wrestler and 350 Days, we wanted it to ring true, both of these. The Wrestler took 7 years from start to finish. 350 Days took 6 years from start to finish because we wanted both of these to ring true. And yeah, I took Aronofsky and the screenwriter and the executive producer to indie wrestling every weekend for 6 months. And Darren would sit in the dressing room and, you know, ask questions and pick brains. And, you know, Jim Cornette didn't like The Wrestler because, you know, it wasn't upbeat, you know, and neither was 350 Days when all is said and done. But that's the reality of it in many, many cases.
I would agree. And I think really we've seen that again with this Dark Side of the Ring documentary series. It's not always a happy story. It's not always the perfect fairy tale for, you know, everybody. And as you stated, I mean, I think one of my favorite scenes in The Wrestler is when he's on the boardwalk with his daughter and he just looks at her and says, "I just don't want you to hate me." it's almost like a life of regret. It's like you sacrifice the person you really are to be the character you portray. And
I interviewed Sherry Martell 3 a.m. one night for a radio interview. She said, I was on the road for 15 years. I didn't see my kid grow up. And she had a lot of pain in her voice when she said it. I'll never forget it. For those who haven't seen it, 350 Days, the title is because guys like Ric Flair were on the road 350 days. Greg Valentine's in it. He told me he was on the road 320 days. Okay, Bret Hart said the other day in a different interview he was on the road 336 days. It's not exaggerated. It's an insane lifestyle. Okay, the sacrifices. So at bare minimum, take care of these guys after they retire. So the fans will say, for example, they're making good money today. Sure, the upper echelon guys, but a lot of the people on an NXT are making less than a New York City school teacher. A school teacher will end up better than these guys because they have the benefits. That's the irony of it all. You have that short run, a couple of years. They future endeavor you, and that's it. That's it.
Now I gotta lighten the mood here.
No, I'm sorry, not to mention all the fact that you pay all your expenses yourself as well, medical expenses, your gym time, your travel expenses for the most part. So all of that comes off the bottom line of everything. So it's not like when they say, oh, this guy makes 150 grand a year, he makes 200 grand a year. Yeah, well, he spends half of it maintaining his body, maintaining his schedule.
And you're supporting your family back home.
Yes.
Yes. Now I gotta lighten the mood up. I gotta lighten the mood up a sec here because I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you one of the central questions that I wanted to ask you from the very beginning, which is the gorilla position. What does that mean? Why did you choose that name?
Well, really, I thought it was a cool. Obviously, it's referring to the backstage area where the wrestlers go to prep before they go. They talk to the agent or the booker back in the day. And actually, I always loved Gorilla Monsoon. I was always a big fan of his, and the gorilla position is named after him. And one of the things I'm most proud of is that I actually got the endorsement from Valerie Morella, his daughter.
Oh,
that
very
it was.
Nice.
She messaged me after this. It was probably about a year, and she said, the name of your website holds a special place in my heart. And I said, well, I hope it's okay that we use it. She said, of course. So that was kind of cool to hear from her. And, I never got the chance to meet Gorilla, but everything I've heard, he was a terrific man and, somebody that was admired by almost everyone in wrestling. So I thought if we're going to go with something that's kind of an homage to old school, let's pay homage to Gorilla.
You used the word proud. What are you proudest of as far as the website? Any particular articles or contributors, or what are you proudest of?
I think a couple things, but I think, again, the fact that many performers have decided to open up to me and tell me their personal stories. I did a story a few years ago with Allie, who's now in AEW as the Bunny, but that she talked about suffering from depression, anxiety, and considering committing suicide. And it got a huge response. I mean, it got a gigantic response. And it wasn't just from wrestling fans. It was from people who had actually gone through those types of things themselves. Those are the kind of stories. If it's powerful enough to get that kind of response, and when I say response, not like from a wrestling standpoint, I mean from an emotional standpoint, that's what I'm most proud of. And I'm also proud of the group of guys and girls that have contributed to us, and that they've gone on to do things great. They one of my former writers was a referee in Impact, and now he's gone on to write for Ripley's Believe It or Not. Our good friend Jim Phillips, he's gone on to do other things. My business partner, when we started the website, he wasn't really back into wrestling much at all. Now he helps produce Ohio Valley Wrestling, and he works for Al Snow. I think my, for lack of a better term, probably my coaching tree is the thing that I'm the most proud of, is the fact that I've been able to give some people a platform and maybe push them along in some directions that they didn't even realize themselves they were capable of. And so, the guys, sometimes they joke around and call me Papa Bear, but you know what? I'll take that. I'll take that as a compliment. If I'm Papa Bear, I'm pretty proud Papa.
Where would you like to see the website go in the next couple of years?
Preferably somebody offers me like a boatload of money for it, and then I can just sell it and retire. But I don't think that's going to. I'd like to more evolve into, again, more. When I first started it and I pitched it to Michael, my partner, I said to him, I kind of want this to be like the Rolling Stone of pro wrestling. I want it to be kind of the hip place, the kind of the pop culture inside look without being too inside. More opinions, more feature stories, more human interest things, as opposed to, as you said, some of the Twitter fodder that's out there. So I'm hoping it continues to evolve that way, and I'm hoping that more and more people want to come along and use it as an opportunity to kind of leverage themselves or springboard themselves into better opportunities. That's my biggest hope is, as I said, I'm not beholden to anyone. I don't need anyone's money. They don't need to support me on Patreon. All I want to do is this project and keep going forward with it, and hopefully help as many people as I can along the way.
There you go, buddy.
What's in the immediate future for Gorilla Position? What do you think you're going to do with the rest of the year? And do you think that we're going to wind up having full in-person shows by, say, fall, or do you think that that's going to be, or do you think people are not going to want to get back into an arena and sit, jam next to each other, maybe for years to come?
As far as the rest of the year goes, I've always visioned the Gorilla Position being more of a eventually morphing into where we're using it to feature young wrestlers who are looking to make their name, and then put that out on social media. Anytime we've ever done a feature about someone, we always put all their social media links and their profile and everything underneath it. That's really my biggest goal long term, is that it's a way to help people that are trying to establish themselves or make a name in the wrestling business and kind of push them along. And it's the same thing with any of the writers or the podcasters I've ever worked with. I'd rather be, the guy that's in the background and kind of cheering, saying, hey, you did a good job, than worry about being the star. And as far as the rest of the year, one of the reasons we've slowed down a lot on content is because I don't feel the need to put out content when there is really nothing to talk about. We used to put out about 8 to 10 posts a day. Now it's more like 3, 4, or 5. But at some point, it just becomes, white noise if you're just talking about things that aren't worth talking about. So I'm hoping that we do get arena shows back. I'm hoping the people embrace going back, even if it's smaller crowds. At least it's crowds, and it generates that buzz that kind of motivates me to, hey, flesh things out a little bit more and expand.
Titan Championship Wrestling out of New Jersey today, they had a live show, and it was done like a drive-in. The fans were in their cars watching the wrestling. What do you guys think of this?
Well, hopefully, everyone was able to do it safely. It's probably more of a risk for the performers than it is for any of the attendees. Whether the performers or not are going to be screened, versus the people who are in their cars. That in itself should be safe enough. But
they had a whole list of all the precautions that they were doing, and the fans were sitting in their cars. So it's an interesting concept. It's like going to a drive-in movie.
Do you know has the show happened yet?
It's today.
It's
today,
probably
happening right now. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you'll have to let me know next week how the show draws.
They sold out.
Wow. Well, that might be the future as we see it there.
And other area promotions announced the same thing, that they were going to do drive-in wrestling. It's strange, right?
Well, it's one of the things you can say about the professional wrestling industry and the people in it is they're very creative. And during this whole crisis, they've had to become pretty creative. We've seen it with, the movie style matches, the matinee style matches, now all to the point that it's literally a drive-in movie.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in to see. I would love to see the video of that or clips of that show just to see how well it went over.
I'll see if I could get it for you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it also proves that people just want to perform as wrestlers under any circumstance. They'll find some way to get out there and fight for a crowd, and B, that there will be an audience for that. If there are two guys, squaring off against each other, people will form a circle and watch it happen. It's just that people want to see that stuff. I mean, that much that they're willing to go to this much of an effort for it. And we've seen Vince, pulling as many strings as he can to get the Florida, state to declare them as essential workers so that they could perform. So we haven't seen that for any other sport or form of entertainment. So, there's just something about wrestling that makes it still people want to have it going on regardless of what the circumstances are in society.
You got to agree. I think it's one of those things. It goes back to the days of the Roman Colosseum. I mean, just the idea of conflict is going to draw a crowd. It's going to draw a reaction from people. I know I said this earlier, but I always use that term, visceral reaction. If you can get the people to buy in and just want to see that. And a friend of mine in the business said, at the end of the day, I still don't get it. We're just a bunch of guys in our underwear pretending to fight. But for some reason, people love it. And that's true. Every time there's a wrestling show, it's going to draw a crowd. It may draw 50 and it might draw 5,000. But for some reason, pro wrestling will live on.
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to how we started the show. Your father, your mother, your grandfather, grandmother took you as a kid, and it's part of your DNA. My mom went to wrestling in the 1950s, and her dad took her. So my grandfather took my grandmother to see Killer Kowalski, who became a good friend of mine. It's DNA. It becomes part of you, and you just love it. And eventually you love it for different reasons. As a kid, everything was real to me. And then the big kids said to me, April 30, 1977, Billy Graham's gonna beat Bruno for the title, and it happened, and I was disillusioned. It wasn't real. But then I enjoyed it on a different level. And today I enjoy it. I enjoy the indies, and I don't enjoy, a WWE show or whatnot. But it's theater for the people. My radio mentor, Fred Giabold, referred to wrestling as the proletarian performance art. Theater for the people. Good versus evil. Very simple. Very simple. They make it too complicated today. Have a good bad guy and a good guy and let them go at it, right?
Well, the funniest thing is I can remember my mother was someone who was, very quiet, nice person, very I don't think I've ever heard her cuss at anything like she would at the TV when, Bruiser Brody was getting beat up by Harley Race or, whatever, it just, those memories, as you said, and just the way that it's almost been passed down from generation to generation is why I think it will live on forever. I don't know in what form. Obviously, it's changing a lot right now, and I think it's going to continue to change a lot due to this pandemic. But I think there will always be wrestling fans. There will always be wrestling fans because in some ways it's a family tradition.
Oh, yeah. Well, my parents detested wrestling and were just absolutely, totally embarrassed that I had anything to do with it. My grandparents had nothing to do with it whatsoever. Turns out that my great-grandmother was one of those tennis-shoed grannies that would whack the wrestlers with the purse as they came down. And like all the wrestlers knew her because she was such an outstanding person over at the Cow Palace, that she would just be, one of those like constant figures. So sometimes it skips 2 generations. And my kids don't give a darn about wrestling now. So I'm probably they're a lost cause as it stands. But who knows? Maybe a couple more generations it'll pop up and it'll be. be a big thing. So, Ryan, do we have any other things you'd like to promote? We're getting close to the end of the hour here. I know that if your house is like my house, after an hour, it's ready to explode because they've all had to be quiet for an hour. So I'd like for you to be able to get in whatever you'd like to promote at this stage.
I would just like to ask everybody to check us out at thegorillaposition.com. And it is thegorillaposition.com. And then follow me on Facebook and Twitter, Ryan K. Boman, and it's Boman is the last name. And other than that, I really appreciate you guys having me on today.
Oh, it's been really wonderful. Evan, do you have any parting words?
I barely read about wrestling, and the Gorilla Position is one of the few websites I savor. Pro Wrestling Stories is excellent also. But other than there's not a lot of websites that I really, savor the content, and I'm proud to be a part of it as well. And keep up the great work. It's
I'll echo that. There's some very well thought out articles that are put in there, and that for people that want to really learn about the business and learn about what is on the minds of the wrestlers themselves, they want to get that information. Gorilla Position's the site to check out for sure.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Ryan, real quick, tell the viewers 3 or 4 articles that you're very proud of, just to give them a taste of what you do.
Well, a lot of the columns, I think, whenever I get the chance to write a column, it used to be weekly. Now it's about twice a month. But the Power of the Pin is my column, PIN, as in wrestling. And I think one of the ones that I'm most proud of is a couple years ago when Cody Rhodes left WWE, I wrote a column about, and he was wrestling for Ring of Honor. I wrote a column about how all these people were criticizing him. How could you turn down that money? How could you leave the machine? You could be a star there, blah, 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 blah. And I argued that he would be a bigger star away from that company.
Absolutely.
And so now looking back, I'm kind of like the cat that ate the canary now. I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess I was right. Sometimes when I write an opinion piece and I can look back on them, and especially the columns, and go, yep, I was. Now, I'm not always right. I will say that. But when I can look back on some of those columns and realize, yep, I was spot on. And a lot of times that's because, you do get to know people in the business. You kind of get that vibe and that feel, and then you can form your opinion off that. So, yeah, some of the stories I've done, particularly about the rise of AEW before people knew that Tony Khan was going to invest, they were going to have a billionaire owner. There's some things that I've kind of gotten a wink at, ahead of time. And so anytime I can kind of predict the future, I always like that.
Nice. That's really great. Well, you've been a wonderful guest. We'd really love to have you on again in the future. If everything, hopefully we're not all locked up on every Saturday, but please have the safest time for you and your family at this point in time. Everyone's talking about, possible resurge of the virus here. So, and Evan is unfortunately still cooped up in New York City with all of that stuff. So I want to make sure that everybody stays safe on that. But you've really been a great guest. We really appreciate having you, and looking forward to reading more Gorilla Position articles really soon.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right. Thanks for being here, and we'll see everyone next week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.